His wife said she was going out for the night. Cool. What she didn't know. He followed her. To the motel. With the football coach. Bad move. Now he's got the footage, the receipts, and a plan. She thought he'd cry. Instead, he went full mastermind. Buckle up. This is the revenge story you didn't know you needed. Marcus Hale's footsteps echoed against the empty sidewalks of Briarwood. A small town that seemed too quiet for a night so heavy with betrayal. The air was sharp, biting at his lungs with each breath as he kept his eyes fixed on the rear lights of a dark sedan turning the corner ahead. That car had just taken off with his wife inside, Sienna Hale, the woman he had shared 20 years of marriage with. Now, without a word or warning, she had vanished into the night with someone Marcus didn't recognize. Earlier that evening, Marcus had left Max, his golden retriever, with Mrs. Whitaker, their elderly neighbor. Her furrowed brow and hesitant nod told him she sensed something was wrong, though he offered no real explanation. He had no words then, only instinct. His body moved automatically, pushed forward by adrenaline and a quiet fury he barely understood. The car veered off toward the edge of town, down a road lined with derelict businesses and forgotten corners. The Hollow Oak, a rundown bar clinging to life on the outskirts, greeted them with its flickering neon lights. Marcus slowed, slipping into the shadows near a rusting delivery truck, eyes trained on the figures emerging. Sienna stepped out first. Her posture was relaxed, familiar, unbothered. Moments later, the driver emerged, tall, broad-shouldered, and unmistakably smug. Derek Vaughn, Silverpine High's new athletic director, exuded the kind of confidence Marcus had always found insufferable. The two moved with practiced closeness, not a trace of hesitation in their touch. They disappeared into the side entrance of the adjoining motel. Marcus stayed in the darkness until the motel office caught his attention. Inside stood Logan Reyes, a young man Marcus had once taught, now employed behind the counter. A quiet exchange followed. No threats, no emotional appeals, just a reminder of old debts and mutual respect. Soon, Marcus had a master key and a room number in hand. The hallway leading to room 12 was dim and hushed, broken only by faint sounds seeping from within the walls. Marcus paused outside the door, every sense on high alert. From within, laughter and movement betrayed what words never could. Without a sound, he turned the key and stepped inside. The room was dimly lit, its air heavy with a mix of cologne and perfume. Clothing lay scattered across the floor in careless abandon. Marcus moved efficiently, capturing images of the scene. Her handbag, his watch, their belongings tangled in a narrative of betrayal. Every photo was a confirmation, a nail in the coffin of denial. Voices floated in from the bathroom, arrogant and self-assured. Marcus didn't flinch. He listened, not out of curiosity but necessity. He needed the full truth, not fragments. Moments later, he stepped out as silently as he had entered, meeting Logan once more in the office. Without a word, the young man handed over a small USB drive, security footage from the motel's exterior cameras. The walk home was slow, burdened by thoughts that offered no comfort. Each step was a reckoning. In his home office, surrounded by silence, Marcus compiled the evidence. Receipts, credit card statements, suspicious withdrawals, all now painted a cohesive and damning picture. As the sun's first light filtered through the blinds, the front door creaked open. He heard the soft thud of footsteps, the careful attempt to slip upstairs unnoticed. But their son, Caleb, had already uncovered the truth. He stood at the top of the stairs, Marcus's tablet in hand, his face pale but resolute. There were no screams, no dramatic confrontations. Sienna stood frozen as she realized what had been discovered. Marcus appeared behind Caleb, quiet and still, his presence a wall she could no longer climb. Bags were already waiting by the door, and just like that, she left. The house fell into silence once more. Marcus shut the door behind her and turned toward the days ahead. The damage was done, but he was just getting started. The silence that settled after Sienna's departure was thicker than any argument could have been. Marcus Hale stood in the foyer, the weight of the night pressing down on his shoulders like the sky itself had lowered. Caleb sat on the staircase, his face expressionless, hands still gripping the tablet that had shattered their family's illusion. There were no tears, no outbursts, only the quiet understanding that something irreparable had occurred. Marcus knelt beside his son, gently taking the device from his hands and setting it aside. Caleb's eyes were distant, anchored in a place between disbelief and fury. Marcus knew that feeling intimately. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Words were inadequate. In their place, a shared silence bound them. Upstairs, the room Sienna had once occupied with Marcus now stood open, its emptiness echoing down the hallway. She hadn't taken everything, just the essentials, but what she left behind felt heavier than what was gone. A half-filled closet. A framed photo turned face down on the nightstand. Perfume lingering in the air like a memory refusing to leave. By mid-morning, Marcus had begun the methodical process of erasing her presence. Clothes were packed into boxes, toiletries discarded, linens stripped. The house had become a battlefield for control, not over her, but over his own environment. He couldn't change the betrayal, but he could reclaim the space it had poisoned. Caleb helped in silence. Occasionally, he would pause, holding a familiar item in his hands before setting it aside with a quiet finality. Marcus never asked what his son was thinking. He already knew. He had lived it. That evening, they sat across from one another at the kitchen table. 2 plates of untouched food rested between them. The television remained off. Outside, the world moved on as if nothing had changed. But inside their home, time had fractured. Marcus broke the silence first, not with explanation or apologies, but with resolve. Plans were made. Locks would be changed. Counts reviewed. A lawyer would be contacted. Caleb listened, nodding once in a while, the stoicism in his young face unsettling. Marcus found himself awake long past midnight, seated in his office, reviewing files he never thought he'd need. Mortgage documents, bank records, insurance policies. Every detail of their shared life now required scrutiny. He wasn't just mourning the loss of a relationship. He was dismantling a structure built over decades. The following day brought a different kind of reckoning. As Marcus walked the halls of Silverpine High, the school where he'd spent nearly 15 years teaching physics, he felt the weight of invisible eyes. Whispers followed him, soft, speculative, but unmistakably aimed in his direction. No one asked questions directly, yet the tension clung to him like static. In the staff lounge, he poured himself a cup of coffee, deliberately ignoring the corner where Derek Vaughn usually held court. Marcus could feel his presence before he heard his voice. Calculated, falsely concerned. But Marcus didn't flinch. He didn't engage. Instead, he turned and left, the coffee untouched. Back home, Caleb was waiting with a question that had been building since the night before. He wanted to know what came next. Not in legal terms, but in life. How would they move forward? Could they? Marcus didn't have a polished answer. What he offered instead was honesty. They would take it one step at a time. They would protect what mattered. And above all, they would do it together. As the week wore on, the pieces began to settle into place. Locks were changed. Passwords updated. The family lawyer, Natalie Cross, was brought in to guide them through the legal tangle ahead. She moved with calm precision, a quiet force in a storm Marcus was still trying to understand. Together, they began drafting the initial filings for divorce. Natalie was thorough, and Marcus appreciated her discretion. He handed over the photos, the receipts, and the USB drive from the motel. She didn't react with shock, only the quiet professionalism of someone who had seen too many lives upended by secrets. One afternoon, Caleb returned home from school with a different kind of look in his eyes. He had overheard classmates discussing his mother, repeating fragments of gossip that twisted the truth. Marcus listened without interrupting. When Caleb finished, Marcus only nodded. People would talk. That was inevitable. But what mattered was how they responded. With dignity, with clarity, and with the understanding that the truth in time would silence the noise. That night, As father and son sat together on the porch, the house behind them felt different. Still scarred, still raw, but undeniably theirs. And while the road ahead remained uncertain, they both understood one thing with absolute clarity. Whatever storm was coming, they would face it side by side. The following Monday arrived with a strange mix of tension and clarity. Marcus Hale stood in front of his bedroom mirror, adjusting his tie with calm, deliberate movements. The bed behind him was cold and undisturbed, a subtle but powerful reminder of how quickly life had shifted. A quiet house, once filled with ordinary routines, now braced itself for the new and the unknown. Silverpine High buzzed with its usual morning rhythm. Students drifted through the halls, conversations blending into a steady hum. Yet when Marcus entered, a subtle shift in atmosphere followed. Colleagues offered polite nods, some with veiled curiosity, others with quiet support. He moved through the corridors with quiet dignity, acknowledging no whispers and returning no glances. In the faculty lounge, he poured himself coffee without haste. The room quieted when Derek Vaughn entered, his presence too loud even in silence. Though Derek carried himself with the usual arrogance, something in his eyes betrayed a flicker of unease. He stood near the sink, pretending to stir his drink, but Marcus didn't so much as glance his way. That simple disregard carried more weight than any confrontation. Later that morning, Principal Grant Dalton requested to see Marcus in his office. The conversation was brief and professional. News of the affair had reached administration, not through Marcus, but through the rapid spread of rumor and implication. Dalton assured Marcus that discretion would be maintained, and that his professional standing was not under review. Marcus nodded, appreciating the steadiness of the man's tone. Meanwhile, Caleb had begun to notice the aftershocks of the unfolding scandal at school. His classmates spoke in hushed tones, eyes flicking his way with a mix of pity and intrigue. He kept his head high, focused on his studies, and channeled his emotions into a project he'd been working on with friends. A science fair exhibit centered on renewable energy systems. It gave him purpose, something constructive amidst the emotional chaos. Back at home, Marcus had turned his attention to organizing legal documentation. Natalie Cross had started compiling evidence, organizing financial records, and arranging the timeline of events. Marcus provided everything she needed, working late into the night to ensure nothing was overlooked. The process was emotionally taxing but gave him a sense of momentum. Within days, Marcus received a visit from Ethan Clark, a former student now working part-time at the motel. He handed over a manila envelope containing printed security footage and timestamps. The material was damning. Natalie reviewed the files and immediately added them to the growing case file. But just as things seemed to stabilize, an unexpected setback shook their progress. One evening, Caleb returned home visibly shaken. The science lab's main project had been damaged. Wires severed, code wiped clean. The school's administration suspected vandalism, though no one had been caught. Caleb was devastated, not only for himself but for the team of students who had spent weeks preparing for the state fair. Marcus examined the ruined components and recognized the targeted nature of the damage. This wasn't an accident. It was deliberate, calculated. He didn't voice his suspicions aloud, but the possibility that Derek had crossed a line beyond infidelity now lingered like a shadow. Marcus contacted Noah Pierce, a discreet private investigator with a reputation for results. Within hours, surveillance equipment had been quietly installed in the lab. Cameras were hidden in ventilation grates, behind posters, and among supply shelves. A watchful silence returned to the school corridors. Over the next few nights, Marcus and one of Caleb's classmates, Lila Thompson, remained after hours to monitor the lab remotely. They rotated shifts, blending in with after-school activity, never drawing attention. Days passed with no incidents. Then, on a quiet Thursday evening, movement triggered an alert. From the screen, they saw a figure enter the lab. Derek Vaughn, alone, moving with purpose. He approached the half-rebuilt project with something in his hand, cutters. The image froze for a moment before Derek reached forward. That was all Marcus needed. Moments later, Marcus stepped out of the shadows and confronted him. There were no raised voices, no dramatic gestures. Just a quiet, controlled presence that froze Derek in place. A few minutes later, security arrived, called by Lila under Marcus's instruction. Officers escorted Derek out of the building. The next day, his suspension was made official. The administration cited conduct unbecoming of staff, though the internal documentation was far more explicit. Marcus didn't gloat. He remained silent, focusing instead on rebuilding the project with Caleb and his classmates. The story of what happened spread quickly. But unlike before, this time the tide had turned. Students, parents, and teachers alike rallied behind Marcus and his son. Their perseverance inspired a quiet unity, a refusal to allow scandal to define them. As the rebuilt science exhibit neared completion, Marcus stood among his students, their laughter and excitement echoing through the lab. For the first time in weeks, he felt the weight begin to lift. Not because the storm had passed, but because they had learned how to stand firm in its eye. As autumn settled over Briarwood, the days grew colder, but Marcus Hale's determination only sharpened. The fallout from Derek Vaughn's exposure had created ripples across Silverpine High and the wider community. Yet Marcus kept his focus. There was more at stake than professional reputation or whispered gossip. He was preparing for the legal battle ahead, a confrontation that would define not only the future of his home but the course of his son's life. Natalie Cross worked methodically, building a comprehensive legal strategy rooted in facts and airtight documentation. The evidence Marcus had gathered painted a clear picture. Months of deceit, financial misconduct, and attempted sabotage. The recordings from Ethan Clark, combined with the security footage and printed messages, left little room for Sienna to manipulate the narrative. Still, Marcus knew better than to underestimate her. Publicly, Sienna remained quiet, but whispers of her attempting to control the story through social media and private conversations began to surface. She painted herself as the victim of a controlling spouse and an unfair legal system. Derek, now disgraced and under formal investigation for property damage and misconduct, quietly aligned with her version. Then came the broadcast. One evening, local news aired an interview featuring Sienna and Derek seated beside one another, carefully curated in tone and framing. Sienna spoke of emotional distress, of being silenced and manipulated, of fleeing a marriage where she never felt seen. Derek, adopting the calm demeanor of a concerned educator, echoed her sentiments, suggesting that Marcus had weaponized his influence to destroy their lives. Marcus watched the segment in silence. Caleb sat beside him, tense, fists clenched. They exchanged no words. There was nothing to say. The performance was transparent yet powerful in its delivery. Marcus knew how easily narratives could be twisted when supported by polished presentation. The next morning, he called a meeting at Briarwood's community center. Word spread quickly. By evening, the large room was filled with residents, colleagues, former students, and curious locals. Marcus stood before them, not to argue or defend, but to present. He offered facts, evidence, documents, timelines, recordings that captured conversations Sienna and Derek never imagined would resurface. With calm clarity, he walked them through the reality behind the rumors. He asked for no judgment, only that people consider the truth beyond spectacle. When he finished, the applause was quiet but affirming. Eyes that once held uncertainty now reflected something different: trust. Meanwhile, Natalie submitted the final case file to the court. The hearing was scheduled within weeks. The legal documents included comprehensive financial analysis, character statements from staff and students, and authenticated digital evidence. It was more than a divorce proceeding. It was a reckoning. On the day of the hearing, Marcus dressed in silence. Caleb accompanied him to the courthouse, calm but visibly bracing himself. Reporters waited on the courthouse steps, cameras flashing, microphones extended, but Marcus didn't break stride. Inside, Sienna and Derek sat together, their expressions tight with performance. Her attorney opened with dramatic flair, portraying Marcus as overbearing and emotionally distant, a man whose perfectionism masked cruelty. Fabricated messages and cherry-picked statements were presented, each intended to cast doubt. But Natalie dismantled their case with clinical precision. One by one, she refuted each claim. Witness testimonies, digital forensics, financial tracing, and, most importantly, the recorded conversation between Sienna and Derek, where they plotted to accuse Marcus of emotional abuse. When the recording played, the courtroom fell into a stunned silence. Even the judge, a seasoned figure known for her composure, paused before speaking. In her verdict, she acknowledged not only the strength of the evidence, but the character demonstrated by Marcus throughout the ordeal. Full custody of Caleb was granted to him. Ownership of the family home was reaffirmed. Legal fees were assigned to Sienna. Her attempt to manipulate the court had backfired. Outside, the media swarmed once more. Marcus shielded Caleb as best he could, offering no statement beyond a polite decline. They returned home in quiet relief, the house now a symbol not of pain but survival. In the days that followed, the community responded swiftly. Sienna's real estate license came under review for ethical violations. Derek faced disciplinary hearings, his career hanging by a thread. Public sentiment had turned, not out of vengeance, but recognition of what had truly occurred. For Marcus, the victory was never about winning. It was about reclaiming truth and safeguarding his son's future. He knew the fight wasn't entirely over. People like Sienna and Derek didn't surrender easily. But with the law on his side and the truth now public, Marcus felt something rare. Peace. As he and Caleb sat beneath the trees in their backyard one cool evening, the weight that had once seemed permanent finally lifted. The sky, though gray, no longer pressed down. They had made it through. Months passed. Winter melted into spring, and the rhythms of life slowly began to reassemble themselves. The Hale household, once thick with tension and silence, breathed again. Marcus and Caleb, having weathered the storm that nearly broke them, now found themselves rebuilding not just a home, but a bond reshaped by hardship and resilience. The remnants of the past lingered in small ways. A forgotten trinket in the back of a drawer, a name overheard on the radio. But neither Marcus nor Caleb allowed those moments to define them. Instead, they focused forward. Their energy turned to the science fair, the project that had once been targeted for destruction now resurrected into something far greater. Marcus threw himself into mentoring Caleb's team. The model of a sustainable city they had originally designed was rebuilt and reimagined with new features. Late nights were spent sketching designs, coding microcontrollers, and testing renewable energy simulations. What began as a school project evolved into a statement of recovery, progress, and collective strength. The science fair arrived on a bright Saturday morning. At the regional convention center, students from across the county filled the space with nervous anticipation. Marcus watched from a distance as Caleb and his teammates presented their work with clarity and passion. Judges asked pointed questions, to which the group responded with confidence built on hours of dedication. When the winners were announced, Silverpine High claimed 3 top awards, including first place for Caleb's team. The auditorium erupted in applause. Marcus remained at the edge of the crowd, his smile quiet but full. He watched as students embraced one another, their triumph not just academic, but emotional. It was during the final group photo that Marcus noticed a familiar figure near the back of the room. Sienna stood partially obscured, her expression unreadable. Their eyes met, briefly, and she turned away before Marcus could decide what he felt. Pity? Resentment? Nothing strong enough to linger. She exited without speaking. That moment was the last time he saw her. In the weeks that followed, Marcus continued his work at Silverpine, his position more secure than ever. The scandal had burned bright, but its embers had cooled. Where whispers once followed him through the halls, now there were nods of respect, quiet acknowledgments of his perseverance. Caleb, too, had found his footing. He focused on college applications, explored engineering programs, and participated in outreach events to mentor younger students. The bitterness once lodged in his voice had faded, replaced by ambition and clarity. They remodeled parts of the house together, painting over old walls and replacing furniture that carried too many memories. It was not about erasing the past, but transforming the space into something that reflected who they were becoming. One evening, as they hosted a small gathering for Caleb's graduation, the house filled with laughter and warmth. Friends, neighbors, former students, people who had stood with them when it mattered, filled the rooms. Music drifted through open windows. The scent of grilled food and fresh flowers mixed with late spring air. Marcus stood near the kitchen island, drink in hand, watching Caleb speak with a group of friends. Pride welled in his chest, not just for academic achievement, but for the strength and character his son had shown. He knew how close things had come to falling apart. Later, as guests trickled out and the evening faded into quiet, Marcus and Caleb sat on the porch once more, the same spot they had shared after Sienna first left. But this time, the silence between them was soft, comforting. Caleb leaned back, his voice casual. "Feels different now." Marcus nodded. "It is." They spoke little, letting the sounds of night fill the space. Insects hummed, wind stirred the trees, and distant laughter lingered from down the block. Before going inside, Marcus glanced at the stars. For the first time in a long while, he felt entirely unburdened. The anger, the grief, the uncertainty, all had given way to something steadier. Not joy, not yet, but peace. They had been tested, lied to, betrayed. But neither he nor Caleb had let that define them. Instead, they had chosen to rebuild, to resist the temptation to retaliate, to believe that integrity mattered, even when it hurt. This wasn't just survival. It was renewal. As the door closed behind them, the house, once fractured, felt whole again.